Why do women who say they're looking for a sensitive man end up falling for the other guy? The one who barely talks, who seems to need nothing from anyone. If this has ever happened to you, if you ever did everything right, listened, were always available, gave in during every argument to avoid conflict, and still watch that person fade away in front of you bit by bit, I want you to know something before you keep watching this video. It wasn't bad luck. It wasn't that she didn't know what she wanted. It was something much deeper. Something that has to do with biology, with instinct, and with a part of you that you've probably been hiding for years without even realizing it. You're going to hear things over the next few minutes that probably contradict everything you've been taught about being a good partner, and I want to be honest with you from the start. Nothing I'm about to share has anything to do with manipulating anyone, or playing with someone else's feelings, or treating a woman like a target to be conquered. If that's what you're looking for, this isn't your video. What you will find here is an explanation of why excessive people-pleasing kills desire, why constant availability kills curiosity, and above all, how to recover a part of yourself that the modern world has taught you to repress. Let's start with something uncomfortable. For years, we were told that to be attractive, we had to be predictable, endlessly agreeable, available at any hour, willing to give in just to avoid conflict. And on paper, that sounds reasonable. Nobody wants to be with someone aggressive, selfish, or who doesn't listen. But there's a huge difference between being a good person and being a person with no backbone, and that difference largely determines whether someone sees you as a secure partner or as someone who's just there waiting to be chosen. Before we get into the deeper psychology, I want you to think about something. Think about the last time someone treated you with a kindness so constant, so predictable, that you started taking it for granted. I'm not necessarily talking about a romantic relationship. Could be a co-worker who always says yes, a friend who never disagrees, someone who never voices their own opinion out of fear of creating tension. At first, that availability is appreciated, but over time, without us consciously deciding it, we stop paying attention to it. Our brain is wired to direct its energy toward what represents uncertainty, toward what hasn't yet been fully figured out. And a completely predictable person with no edges, no resistance of any kind, stops generating that mental activation we call interest. Evolutionary psychology has been studying this phenomenon for decades. This isn't just my opinion, it's a pattern observed again and again in studies on attraction and bonding. The human brain, without us consciously deciding it, looks for signs that the other person can hold themselves together, signs of emotional stability, that they won't crumble at the first problem, that they have their own life with meaning, with direction, with something that matters to them beyond the relationship itself. When those signs disappear, when a person starts organizing their entire existence around another person's approval, something breaks in how the bond is perceived. It stops feeling like an encounter between two whole people and starts feeling like a burden. I want to pause for a moment on where all this comes from because I think without understanding its origin, it's impossible to truly change it. Most men who fall into this pattern of excessive people-pleasing weren't born that way. They learned it. Many grew up in environments where adult approval depended on behaving well, not causing conflict, anticipating others' needs before even recognizing their own. That child who learned that love was earned by being useful, by being obedient, by being as little trouble as possible, grows over time into an adult who repeats that exact same pattern in their romantic relationships, at work, in their friendships. It's not a character flaw, it's an emotional survival strategy that made sense at the time, but that ends up working against you in adult life. This is where a concept comes in that I want to develop with you throughout this video. Carl Jung, one of the most influential psychologists of the 20th century, spoke of something he called the shadow. The shadow is that part of our personality that we reject, that we hide, that we consider unacceptable, and that we therefore push out of our conscious awareness. The problem is that what we repress doesn't disappear. It simply stops being under our control. And in the case of many men, that repressed shadow includes traits like firmness, the ability to say no, silence, mystery, and self-assurance without needing to constantly justify it. I'm not talking about cruelty. I'm not talking about coldness or treating anyone badly. I'm talking about the difference between a man who exists to please and a man who simply exists, period, and who also chooses to share his life with someone. That difference changes everything, and we're going to break it down into several concrete signals you can start working on today. The first signal has to do with eye contact. Holding someone's gaze without nervously looking away communicates something no words can, that you're not afraid to be seen, that you don't need to hide, that you're fully present in that moment. Most people, when they feel discomfort or insecurity, look away almost immediately. It's an automatic, almost instinctive gesture, and the other person's brain reads it without either of them consciously thinking about it. Holding eye contact a few seconds longer than usual without overdoing it, without turning it into an uncomfortable challenge, conveys calm. And calm, in a world full of anxiety, is magnetic. The second signal is silence. We live in a culture that rewards filling every pause, every empty space in a conversation, as if silence was something to be avoided at all costs. But silence used well communicates confidence. When someone asks a question and you take 2 seconds before answering instead of immediately jumping in to fill the void, you're communicating that your words carry weight, that you don't talk just to talk, that you think before responding. This doesn't mean staying silent all the time or becoming distant. It means no longer being afraid of pauses. The third signal, probably the most important of all, is the ability to say no. This sounds simple, but it's where most men fail most deeply. Saying no to a plan that doesn't interest you, saying no to a request that doesn't seem reasonable, saying no without endless explanations or apologizing for having your own opinion. Every time you give in on something that genuinely matters to you just to avoid conflict, you're sending a silent message. My well-being is negotiable. My boundaries are flexible. My time has no real value. And that message, repeated over and over, erodes the respect the other person has for you, even if in the moment it looks like you're being generous. Let me give you an example. No names, based on patterns that repeat constantly. Imagine a man who, every time his partner suggests a plan, automatically cancels whatever he had going on without even asking himself whether he actually felt like it or not. At first, that gesture looks like a sign of devotion, of generosity. But over time, the partner starts to notice that this availability doesn't come from genuine desire, but from a fear of disappointing. And when the other person senses that your decisions aren't coming from your own will, but from fear of losing them, the relationship stops feeling like a bond between equals. Without anyone intending it, it turns into an unbalanced relationship where one person carries the weight and the other is carried. The fourth signal has to do with the body and how you move through the world. I'm not talking about being rough or imposing your physical presence on anyone who doesn't want it. I'm talking about moving with intention, taking up the space that's yours without shrinking, without apologizing for existing. Many men, without realizing it, adopt postures that constantly communicate apology. Hunched shoulders, hurried steps, avoiding taking up space. The body speaks before words do, and a body that moves calmly, that isn't in a rush to prove anything, communicates a confidence no speech can match. The fifth signal is the hardest of all. Staying calm when everything around you is falling apart, when a problem comes up, when an argument breaks out, when tension rises, the person who manages to stay centered, who doesn't react out of panic or a desperate need to fix everything immediately, automatically becomes a point of reference. In stressful situations, the human brain instinctively looks for the most stable person in the group, and that stability isn't faked, it's trained. There's a sixth signal almost never mentioned in this kind of content, and it's your relationship with your own time. A man who replies to messages instantly, without exception, at any hour, who rearranges his entire schedule to be available immediately, is communicating something very different from what he thinks he's communicating. He believes he's showing interest and commitment. In reality, he's communicating that his time has no value of its own, that it can be interrupted at any moment at no cost whatsoever. Time is one of the most limited resources that exists, and how you protect it or don't says a lot about the respect you have for yourself. This isn't about deliberately ignoring messages or playing games with response times as a strategy. It's about responding when you can actually give your full attention instead of interrupting every part of your life out of anxiety about not replying fast enough. There's also a seventh signal related to humor and authenticity. Many men, trying to please, laugh at things they don't find funny, agree with opinions they don't actually share, soften every comment until it loses all its original flavor. And although it seems like a harmless gesture, over time the other person senses that they don't really know who's in front of them because every reaction seems calculated to please rather than genuine. Laughing only when something genuinely strikes you as funny, expressing disagreement when you feel it, Keeping your own sense of humor even when it doesn't always match the other person's are small gestures that communicate a solid identity. Someone who doesn't need to completely merge with the other person to feel accepted. Now, I want to pause here because this is important and I don't want you to gloss over it. None of this works if it becomes a mask, a performance you put on to get something from another person without them really knowing who you are. If you adopt these traits only as a strategy, as a temporary disguise to impress, the other person will notice sooner or later because the gap between what you project and what you actually feel always ends up surfacing. What I'm proposing isn't a character. It's a reconciliation with yourself, with parts of your character you probably repressed for years out of fear of seeming difficult, fear of not being loved, fear of rejection. And here I want to share something personal. For a long time, I confused being a good person with having no boundaries. I said yes to everything, avoided any kind of friction, apologized even when I hadn't done anything wrong. And what I discovered over time is that this way of living didn't just affect my relationships, it affected my relationship with myself. I lived worrying about what others thought, constantly adjusting my behavior to avoid any kind of disapproval, and that, over time, creates an enormous emptiness because you end up building a life that isn't really yours, but one designed not to inconvenience anyone. I remember one specific period when I realized this in a fairly uncomfortable way. I was in a group conversation. Someone raised an idea I completely disagreed with, and instead of saying what I thought, I nodded along. Not because I agreed, but because I didn't want to create tension. Walking out of that meeting, I felt a kind of unease that was hard to explain, as if I had betrayed something small but important inside myself. Over time, I understood that unease was the direct consequence of years of accumulated moments of saying yes when I actually wanted to say no, and that was, in a way, the starting point for everything I'm sharing with you today. Change doesn't happen overnight. There's no switch you flip and suddenly become a different person. What exists is a process, and I want to share 3 phases of that process with you because I think it's the most useful part of this whole video. The first phase is recognition. Before changing anything, you need to identify the specific areas of your life where you're suppressing your own voice. It might be at work, taking on tasks that aren't yours out of fear of saying no. It might be with your family, silencing your opinions to avoid conflict. It might be in your relationships, constantly giving in to keep the peace. The exercise here is simple but uncomfortable. For 1 week, pay attention to every moment when you say yes while actually wanting to say no. Just observe it without judging yourself yet. Write it down if you need to, on your phone, in a notebook, whatever's easiest for you. Don't try to fix it right away. Just gather information about yourself as if you were an outside observer studying your own behavior. The second phase is practicing in small doses. This isn't about waking up tomorrow and turning into a completely different person. That would generate rejection from the people around you, and you'd probably end up retreating because of how jarring the sudden change feels. It's about choosing a small, low-risk situation and practicing there. Saying no to a plan you genuinely don't feel like doing, holding eye contact 1 extra second in an everyday conversation, letting a silence pass instead of automatically filling it. These are small gestures, almost invisible to others, but over time they rebuild your relationship with yourself. Here's one concrete exercise you can start today. The next time someone asks you for a favor you don't feel like doing, instead of automatically saying yes, give yourself 1 second of pause before answering. That second, seemingly insignificant, is the space where your autonomy begins to be born. The third phase is calibration, and this one is essential because it's where many men get it wrong. Not every situation or every person calls for the same intensity. Someone who misreads firmness as aggression probably needs you to adjust how you communicate, not to abandon your boundaries. And I want to be very clear about something I consider essential here. Calibration never means ignoring what the other person expresses or pushing when someone sets a clear boundary, or reading someone else's silence or discomfort as part of some game. Respecting other people's boundaries isn't optional or negotiable. It's the foundation everything else rests on. The confidence we're building here is measured by your ability to hold yourself together, not by your ability to bend another person to your will. I want to come back to the science for a moment because I think it's important to understand why all of this works on such a deep level. There are studies on social perception that show something curious. People who describe themselves as more self-assured don't necessarily have fewer internal insecurities than everyone else. The difference is that they've learned not to export that insecurity outward in every interaction. They don't constantly seek validation. They don't need every gesture from the other person to confirm that they're okay, that they're enough, that they deserve to be there. And that emotional self-sufficiency, paradoxically, is what generates deeper genuine connection because it frees the other person from the burden of having to emotionally hold someone else up all the time. There's also research on what are called attachment styles, a framework originally developed to understand the bond between infants and caregivers, and which today is widely applied to adult relationships. People with a more anxious attachment style tend to need constant confirmation that they're loved, repeatedly check messages, interpret any silence from the other person as a sign of rejection. People with a more secure attachment style, on the other hand, tolerate uncertainty better, trust that the bond can hold even without constant confirmation, and precisely because of that, they generate a sense of stability that comes across as attractive to those around them. What's interesting is that attachment style isn't a fixed life sentence. With conscious work, it's possible to shift toward a more secure attachment, and many of the practices we've described today, holding boundaries, tolerating silence, not needing constant approval, are exactly the kind of exercises that contribute to that shift. Think about this. When someone depends entirely on other people's approval to feel good about themselves, every interaction becomes a test. The other person feels, even if they never say it out loud, that they have to carefully manage what they say and do so as not to hurt the other, so as not to trigger a crisis. That's exhausting, and over time, that exhaustion turns into distance, even if everything looks calm on the surface. By contrast, when someone has a solid foundation of self-worth, when they don't need every gesture from the other person to confirm their value, the relationship becomes a space of freedom instead of a constant exam. You can disagree without it becoming a tragedy. You can have a bad day without it destabilizing the whole bond. You can say what you think without needing to soften it until it loses all meaning. I also want to talk about something almost nobody mentions in this kind of content. The mystery people talk so much about isn't about withholding information or playing mind games with anyone. It's about having a life of your own so full, so interesting, that you don't need to lay it all out in every conversation. Real mystery comes from depth, not secrecy. A person who has projects, interests, friends, a routine that gives them meaning naturally comes across as intriguing because there's more to discover. It's not a strategy. It's a natural consequence of having a rich life beyond the relationship. It's worth distinguishing here between two types of men who, on the surface, might look similar, but are fundamentally different underneath. There's the man who stays quiet out of fear because he doesn't trust that his opinion is worth anything, because he'd rather disappear than risk conflict. And there's the man who chooses silence because he doesn't feel the need to fill every space, because his confidence doesn't depend on constantly talking. From the outside, both may look quiet, but one acts from fear and the other from choice. And that internal difference, though invisible at first glance, ends up showing over time because fear generates tension and choice generates calm. And this brings me to what I consider the most important point in the whole video. Nothing we've talked about so far should be done by thinking first about how it will affect another person. It should be done because you deserve to live with integrity, with clear boundaries, with a healthy relationship with yourself. If you develop these traits only as a tool to attract someone, that purpose will eventually run dry because there's nothing more exhausting than maintaining a version of yourself designed solely to please someone else. Work on this for yourself first. The natural consequence of that, almost always, is that the relationships around you improve, not because you're manipulating anything, but because a person who respects themselves naturally attracts healthier, more balanced relationships. I also want to get ahead of a doubt that's probably coming up as you listen to this. You might be thinking, what if I do all of this and the relationship still doesn't work out? What if I set boundaries and the other person pulls away? That's a real possibility, and I'm not going to promise you otherwise. But think about it this way. If someone pulls away precisely when you start respecting yourself, that relationship was probably built on a foundation that wasn't healthy for either of you. This isn't about guaranteeing that every relationship improves with these changes. It's about the fact that wherever you apply this, you end up becoming a more complete, more stable person, and that, sooner or later, naturally filters the kind of bonds that stay in your life. Before wrapping up, I want to leave you with something to reflect on. The next time you feel the urge to give in on something that genuinely matters to you just to avoid a moment of discomfort, stop for a second. Ask yourself whether that giving in comes from a genuine desire to be generous or from an old fear of not being enough. That distinction, small as it seems, is the starting point for everything we've talked about today. The path toward a firmer, more secure, more complete version of yourself isn't walked in a day or a week, or by watching a single video. It's walked by choosing, again and again, to hold your boundaries even when it's uncomfortable, to sit with silence when you would have once filled it out of anxiety, to say what you actually think, even when there's a risk not everyone will like it. Nobody else can walk that path for you. And the good news is that every small choice in that direction gradually rebuilds the most important relationship you'll ever have, the one you have with yourself. If you made it to the end of this video, comment, "I made it." And I'll personally reply to you myself. And if it resonated with you, subscribe to be part of this and hit like if you enjoyed it.